The morning they laughed at him, the thermometer nailed to the side of the milking shed had already climbed past 91 degrees, and it wasn't yet 8 o'clock. Walter Brennan stood at the edge of his north pasture, with 70 head of black Angus moving slow through the blue stem behind him, and 3 men in a brand-new Ford F350 pulled up on the gravel shoulder to tell him in so many words that he was a fool. What none of those men knew, what Walter himself had only half remembered for 35 years, was that buried under the brush at the far corner of his land, beneath 100 years of forgetting, there was something his father had told him to keep, something a man named Ezra Brennan had carried out of the Niobrara quarry on a wagon in the summer of 1921, stone by limestone stone, and set into the earth with his own hands. And by the time the season turned, the men who laughed that morning would not be laughing anymore. If you've ever stood on land, your grandfather worked and felt the weight of something older than memory pressing up through the soles of your boots, stay with us. Stories like this are why this channel exists. Subscribe and ring the bell so the next quiet one finds you when you need it most. Cherry County, Nebraska sits in the long grass country where the sandhills roll west toward Wyoming, like a green sea that has forgotten how to move. The wind comes down off the high plains and finds nothing to break it except cottonwoods along the creek bottoms and the occasional windmill leaning into its work. Walter Brennan was 72 years old that July morning in 2019, and he had lived every one of those years inside a 15-mile radius of where he was standing. His grandfather Ezra had broken the first ground in 1908. His father Silas had taken it over in 1946 after coming home from the Pacific with a slight tremor in his left hand and a habit of writing everything down in pencil. Walter had inherited the place in 2004, the spring his father died, and he had been carrying it on his shoulders ever since, the way a man carries a coat he forgot he was wearing. He was a tall man, even at 72, lean the way men who have skipped lunch for 50 years are lean, with hands that look too large for his wrists, and a face the sun had worked on patiently for most of a lifetime. He wore a canvas jacket the color of dust, no matter what color it had started out as, and a feed store cap that said Sandhills Cooperative across the front, faded almost to white. He didn't say much. He never had. Eleanor, his wife of 47 years, said once that talking to Walter was like talking to a deep well. You got something back, but you had to wait for it. That summer was the 4th dry one in a row. The creek that cut across the south end of the property, the one the old plat maps still called Whitman Run after a homesteader nobody remembered, had stopped flowing in mid-June. By the first week of July, it was a chain of muddy pools, each smaller than the last, the kind a man could step across without lengthening his stride. Walter had been hauling water in from the co-op in Valentine twice a week, paying $87 a load, and the math of it was wearing thin. He had run the numbers on a yellow legal pad at the kitchen table the night before, and the numbers had looked back at him without sympathy. $16,000 in trucked water since May, hay up 40%, and the note on the back 100 acres coming due in November, like a freight train you could hear before you could see. He had bought the 70 head of Angus in April instead of the combine. That was the choice that had brought Dale Kramer and the Holloway brothers down the county road that morning, riding 3 across in a truck that still wore the dealer lot stickers on the back window. Dale was 58. A big man going soft in the middle with the loud confidence of someone who had borrowed against next year's crop one too many times and gotten away with it. The Holloway brothers, Lyle and Curtis, ran a corn and soy operation 2 roads east. They had bought matching green combines the fall before, and they had not let a conversation pass since without mentioning it. The F35 stopped on the gravel with its engine still running. The way men stop a vehicle when they don't plan to stay long, but want you to know they were here. Dale rolled the window down and rested his elbow on the door. "Walt, what in the Lord's name are you doing with all them cattle out here?" Walter turned slow. The cattle behind him kept on at the blue stem. "Clearing it." Dale looked at Lyle. Lyle looked at Curtis. And then the three of them laughed the way men laugh when they've already decided something is foolish and just need one more second to enjoy the knowing of it. "Clearing it." Dale shook his head. "Walt, you put a $200,000 combine in that ground, you'd have the whole northeast quarter tiled and planted by October. Beans next year, corn the year after. That's how a man works dirt in this county. Not with a bunch of bony cows pushing through the sumac like it's still 1910. Walter said nothing. The wind moved a little through the grass. "My boy's selling his old case down in Ainsworth." Dale went on the way a man goes on when he's already past the point of expecting an answer. "I could put you in touch, fair price. Better than putting your money into beef when the market's flat as a board." "Appreciate it." That was all Walter said. 2 words flat as the road. Dale waited a moment longer, then snorted, raised the window halfway, and the F-35O pulled back onto the asphalt and made its way west toward town, raising a thin ribbon of dust that hung in the still air a long time after the truck was gone. Walter stood there a while. The cattle had not noticed any of it. They moved through the blue stem in their slow, patient way, heads down, tails flicking at the early flies, working the brush line back toward the fence. He watched them for what might have been 5 minutes or 10. He didn't check his watch. Out here, a man learned early that the watch was for other people. What Dale Kramer didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the cattle weren't the point. The cattle were a means. And the means had been chosen because somewhere under the brush at the far corner of that pasture, under 30 years of hawthorn and wild plum, and the slow accumulation of forgetting, there was something Walter had been carrying in his chest since a snowy February evening in 1984. Something his father had pressed into his hands across the kitchen table and told him, in so many words, never to disturb until the day came when he needed it. That day Walter was beginning to suspect was somewhere near. He drove back to the house at noon. Eleanor was on the porch with a glass of iced tea sweating onto the railing beside her, the way she always was at noon in July. She had been a schoolteacher in Valentine for 31 years, and she still kept the posture of a woman who had spent her career standing in front of children, which is to say she sat very straight and noticed everything. She watched him come up the steps, and she watched the set of his shoulders before he said a word. "Dale, come by." He did, and said I was a fool. Eleanor smiled a small smile. "Well, he's been saying that since 1987. He has." She passed him the iced tea which she had poured for him the moment she had seen the truck turn into the lane. Walter sat down on the porch step beside her chair, which was the way they had sat together for 47 years, not facing each other, but facing the same direction, looking out at the same piece of ground. "I'm going to look for it tonight," he said. Eleanor didn't ask what. She knew. "The card's still in the box." "It is." "Then you know where to start." He drank the tea. The ice had already melted in the heat, but it was still cold and it was good. The porch boards were warm under his palms. Somewhere out past the windbreak, a meadowlark was calling and being answered by another. One farther off, Eleanor reached over and put her hand on the back of his neck, brief the way she did sometimes when there were no words for what needed saying. Then she took her hand back, and they sat that way until the meadowlarks moved on, and the silence settled in for the afternoon. That night, after the chores were done and the supper dishes washed and put away, Walter went upstairs to the bedroom he had slept in since 1972 and opened the top drawer of the cedar dresser his father had built him as a wedding present. Inside the drawer, beneath a folded pair of suspenders he no longer wore and a tin of camphor that had outlasted the cough. It was meant for, sat the cedar box. It was small. not larger than a man's two hands held together. The wood had gone dark with age and with the oil of his father's fingers and his own. The corners worn round the brass hinges tarnished green where they joined the lid. Silas had given it to him on a February night in 1984, 2 months after Walter married Eleanor, with snow coming sideways past the kitchen window and the radio playing a weather report that nobody in the room wanted to hear. Walter had been 28 years old that night. He had not understood then what he was being given. He had understood only that his father, who never made a ceremony of anything, was making a small one. He carried the box to the bed and sat down with it on his knees. He opened it slowly. Inside were the things that had been inside it for 35 years. A pair of mother-of-pearl cufflinks his father had worn to the funeral of a cousin in 1959 and never again. A folded square of cotton handkerchief yellowed at the creases. A brass key to a padlock that no longer existed. And underneath all of these at the very bottom, a single index card 3 inches by 5, the white of it gone the color of weak tea. Walter lifted it out. The numbers were written in his own hand, copied in 1984 from his father's pencil on a sheet of notebook paper that had since gone soft and crumbled away. 60 feet in from the northeast corner property line, 12 feet south of the drainage easement. Drilled no dug by limestone hand 1921. Ezra Brennan. Casing sound as of 1986. He had read these words perhaps 5 times in 35 years. He read them now a 6th time slowly. The way a man reads scripture he has known by heart since boyhood. And then he turned the card over. He had never turned it over. In 35 years he had never once turned the card over. On the back, in faint pencil that had nearly gone to nothing, was a line of his father's handwriting that Walter had not known was there. 6 words set down in the cramped, careful script Silas used when he was recording something he meant to be kept. Ask Otis. He helped my father carry the stones. Walter sat very still on the edge of the bed. The bedroom was quiet around him, in the way old farmhouses are quiet at night, which is to say not quiet at all. The joist shifting somewhere in the walls, the refrigerator cycling on downstairs, the distant call of a barn owl out past the equipment shed. He held the card and he read the 6 words again, and a 3rd time and a 4th. Otis Pemberton, 81 years old now if he was a day, lived alone in a cinder block house outside Gordon in Sheridan County, 2 hours west by the old highway. Walter hadn't seen him in 9 years, not since the funeral of Otis's wife in the spring of 2010. Otis had drilled wells for a living from 1958 to 1998. Hand-dug, machine-drilled every kind of well a man could put into the ground in the western sandhills. And his father, Mose Pemberton, had been a young man in this county in 1921. Walter had known none of this connection, none. His father had carried it for 56 years and had written it on the back of a card and had never spoken it aloud, because that was the way Silas Brennan had moved through the world, recording what was true and trusting that true things would be found by those who needed them. Eleanor came into the bedroom and saw him sitting there with the card in his hand and the cedar box open on his knees, and she did not ask what he had found. She crossed to the bed and sat down on the other side of the box, and she waited. He passed her the card. She read the front. She turned it over. She read the back. She read it again. And then she looked up at him with eyes that had been reading Walter's face for 47 years, and she said only, "Well." That was all. Just well. Walter took the card back and set it carefully on top of the cufflinks, and he closed the lid of the cedar box, and he heard the small soft click of the brass catch settling. He put the box on the nightstand. He turned the lamp off. Eleanor lay down beside him in the dark, and the house went on with its small night sounds around them, and neither of them said anything for a long time. He didn't sleep until almost 3. He drove out at first light. The road west toward Gordon ran through country he had crossed 100 times in his life, and not once in the last 5 years. The long flat reaches of the sandhills with their grass standing yellow against the morning sun. The occasional cluster of cottonwoods marking where a creek had once thought about running, the white blade of a wind turbine turning slow against the pale sky at the horizon. He drove with the window down and the radio off. He passed 2 other vehicles in 90 minutes. Otis Pemberton's house sat at the end of a dirt track 3 miles north of Gordon, with a windmill listing slightly to the east and a yard full of equipment that had not moved in 15 years. The old man came out onto the porch before Walter had finished parking, having heard the truck coming for the last half-mile. He was small now, smaller than Walter remembered, stooped at the shoulders the way men get stooped when they have spent 50 years bending into work. His eyes were milky at the edges, but the way he stood, hands in his pockets, looking at Walter, the way a man looks at someone he has been half expecting for years, that part was the same. Walter Brennan. Otis. Been a while. It has. The old man jerked his chin toward the porch chairs. Walter climbed the steps and sat down. Otis went inside for a moment and came back with 2 mugs of black coffee, and he handed one to Walter and sat down in the other chair with a small grunt of accommodation. For a while they did not speak. That was all right. They drank their coffee and they watched the wind move the dry grass beyond the yard. Finally, Otis said, "You found it." Walter looked at him. "The card. Your father's card." "How'd you know?" "Because you drove 2 hours to see an old man you ain't laid eyes on in nearly a decade." Otis took a slow sip of his coffee. "And because Silas told me the year before he died that when his boy finally turned the card over, he'd come and find me. So here you are." Walter set the mug down on the porch rail. His hand was not quite steady. He hadn't known that. He hadn't known any of that. His father had spoken to Otis Pemberton in the last year of his life, had spoken to him about this thing, and had not spoken of it to Walter. And the weight of that knowledge settled on him slowly, the way snow settles on a roof in the small hours. "Tell me," he said. Otis looked out at the grass for a long moment before he answered. "Your great-grandfather, Ezra, summer of 1921. Worst drought this country had seen since the white man arrived. Creek dried up, the dug well at the homestead silted out, his cattle dying off 2 and 3 a week. My father, Mose Pemberton, he was 19 years old that summer, hired on as a hand to help Ezra do what no one else in the county was willing to try. They went up to the Niobrara quarry with a team of 3 horses and a flatbed wagon, and they hauled limestone 12 miles back across country to the northeast corner of your place. Took them all of July and the first half of August. 40 trips, my father told me. 40 trips with that wagon, and Ezra paying him $1 a day and a noon meal." Otis paused. He drank from his mug. They dug the shaft by hand, 42 feet down, lined every foot of it with cut limestone course by course, fitted tight enough you couldn't slip a knife blade between the stones. Hit water on the 18th of August. Sweet water, the kind that comes up from the Ogallala, 220 feet of sandstone underneath. Never quit running since the last ice melted. Ezra capped the well in October with a cast-iron lid he had freighted in from Omaha. Harwell Supply Company. 18 inches across, 3/4 inch thick. Set it flush with the ground and let the brush grow over it on purpose, because Ezra Brennan was a man who had learned in 1921 that other people would come for what you had if they knew you had it. Walter was very still. My father carried the secret of that well his whole life. Told me about it the year I started in the drilling business, 1958. Said someday a Brennan would come looking, and when he did, I should help him. Then your father came to see me summer of 2003, sat right where you're sitting. Told me he had marked the location on a card and given it to his boy, and that the boy didn't yet know what he was holding. Otis turned and looked at Walter directly, his milky eyes meeting Walter's across the small space between the two chairs. Said his boy was a slow man, meant it as praise. Said his boy would come to it in his own time, and that I should be ready when he did. Walter could not speak for a moment. He had not known any of it. In all the years his father had been alive, in all the long winter evenings they had sat across the kitchen table from each other, neither man speaking much. His father had never once given him this. Not the trip to Otis, not the conversation in 2003, not the word slow man which Walter could hear now in his father's voice as clearly as if Silas was sitting on the porch beside them. He set the coffee down again. He looked out at the wind in the grass, and the wind blurred a little in his vision, and he sat with that for as long as he needed to sit with it. "Will you come?" he said finally. "Will you come and help me find it?" Otis nodded once. "I've been waiting on the asking." Walter drove home through the long afternoon with the card in his shirt pocket and the cedar box which he had brought along without quite knowing why on the bench seat beside him. Eleanor met him on the porch when he pulled in. She read his face the way she always read it, and she went into the kitchen and put a kettle on, and she did not ask him to explain anything until he was ready to explain it. He told her over supper, slowly, the way Otis had told it to him. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he was done, she sat for a while with her hands folded around her coffee cup. Then she got up and walked into the front room and came back with the day's mail which she had not yet shown him. She set an envelope on the table between them. It was from the First Sand Hills Bank of Valentine. Walter looked at her. He looked at the envelope. He picked it up and slit it open with his thumbnail, and he unfolded the single sheet of letterhead inside, and he read it once, and then he read it a second time. The words did not change. The note on the back 100 was being moved to active risk review, effective immediately. Fourth consecutive year of declining yield documentation. Insufficient sustainable water access on file. 90 days to demonstrate a permanent on-site water source, or the loan would be restructured under terms. The letter did not yet specify, but Walter knew from 40 years of dealing with that bank would not be terms a man could carry. 90 days. He set the letter down on the table next to the cedar box. Eleanor reached across and put her hand flat on the lid of the box, and she held it there. She did not say, "Walter, it's time." She did not need to. He could hear it in the small, steady pressure of her palm on the cedar, the same way he had heard everything she had ever needed to say to him in 47 years of marriage, in the things she did not need words for. Outside, somewhere past the windbreak, the barn owl called once, and a long while later was answered. The sleep that did come that night came in small pieces. Walter rose before 4, sat in the dark kitchen for a while with his hands flat on the table, and watched the eastern window go from black to the dirty pewter color that mornings wear when summer has begun to lose its patience. The letter from First Sand Hills lay where Eleanor had set it the night before, folded back into its envelope, the bank's blue seal turned upward like an eye. He didn't touch it. He had read it enough times in his head between 2 and 4 to memorize the cadence of the language, which was the language men in offices used when they had already decided something and were giving you the courtesy of pretending you still had a vote. He drank his coffee black and went out to the equipment shed when the sky began to show color. The brush hog hadn't been off its block since the summer of 2014, when he had used it to clean a fence line along the south pasture, and then parked it because there had been no further reason to run it. 5 seasons of dust had settled on the deck. Mice had built 3 separate nests inside the gearbox housing, which he discovered when he pulled the inspection plate, and a small gray cloud of shredded baling twine fell out onto the concrete floor. He stood looking at it for a moment, hands on his hips, and made a sound that was almost a laugh, and not quite. "All right," he told the gearbox. "All right then." He spent the morning on it. He cleaned out the nest with a shop rag and a length of bent wire. He pulled the PTO shaft and found the U-joint stiff with old grease that had gone the color and consistency of axle paste. He worked it loose with a propane torch and a pair of channel locks, his knuckles barking against the housing twice in the process. And by the time he had it turning freely again, the sun was high enough to throw his shadow short and sharp across the shed floor. He checked the blade bolts. 2 of the 3 were sound. The third had rusted through where it met the carrier, and he didn't have a replacement that would fit. He stood looking at it the way a man looks at one more thing that he ought to have foreseen. He drove into Valentine at noon for the bolt. Hatch's Hardware sat on the north side of the highway, between the feed mill and the building that had been a Ben Franklin until 1991 and was now nothing in particular. Old Tom Hatcher had been dead 9 years, and his son Edgar ran the place now, a soft-spoken man in his middle 50s, who had inherited his father's habit of not asking unnecessary questions. Walter found the bolt he needed in a bin near the back, took it to the counter, and laid down a $5 bill. Edgar rang it up. He looked at Walter over the top of his reading glasses the way Edgar looked at everyone and said, "How's that pasture project coming along, Walt?" Walter looked at him. "Word travels," Edgar said, not unkindly. He pushed the change across the counter, and then, without making any particular thing of it, he reached under the counter and brought out a small canvas pouch and set it on top of the change. "Couple extra carriage bolts in there, same size, in case that one ain't the only one gone." Walter looked at the pouch. He looked at Edgar. "What do I owe you?" "You don't." A long beat passed between them. Somewhere at the back of the store, a swamp cooler kicked on with a soft sigh. "My granddad worked for your granddad in 36, Edgar said. "Whole summer. Said he never once got paid late. Said it like it was a thing worth saying." He nodded once, slow. "You take them bolts, Walt." Walter took them. He drove home with the canvas pouch on the seat beside him, and didn't say much to himself for the length of the trip. 40 miles of county road through grass and sky and the occasional white face of a Hereford watching from a pasture. And somewhere inside that long drive, he understood without quite letting the understanding rise to the surface that the country he had lived in his whole life was not the country he had been told it was. Or that perhaps it was both. The same men who laughed at you from a Ford F-350 in the morning could also be the men whose fathers had decided 3 generations back that the Brennan name was good. He didn't yet know what to do with that knowledge. He simply held it the way he held the steering wheel, lightly, without grip. By the second afternoon, the brush hog was running. Otis arrived in his rust-pocked Chevy at 6 o'clock that evening, climbed down with a hand on the door for balance, and walked the perimeter of the northeast corner once before he said anything at all. Walter walked behind him, a respectful 3 paces back, the way he had walked behind his father at this same fence line 40 years before. The brush was head high in places, 30 years of hawthorn, the kind that grows in twisted black spines and tears at canvas like it has a personal interest in the matter. Wild plum below it, sumac threading through, a whole vocabulary of refusal. "You'll go in from the north," Otis said. "That's what I figured. Don't try to take the heaviest stuff first. Skirt it. Make 3 passes around the outside before you cut in. The cattle worked it for you on the south side already. I can see that. Let them keep at the rest while you cut." "All right." Otis turned and looked at him then. His eyes had the milky edge of cataracts coming on, but the center of them was clear. And what they were doing was not so much looking at Walter as looking through him at something further back. You ain't gonna find it on the first day, Walt, or the second. I know it. Your great-grandfather covered it deliberate. He didn't just let the brush grow. He pulled fill over the cap. There's a foot of dirt on top of that iron at minimum. Maybe 18 inches. You'll cut the brush and you won't see a thing and you'll think the card was wrong. And what do I do then? Otis put a hand on his arm. Brief. You keep cutting. He cut for 3 days. The first day he worked from 7 in the morning until the heat broke him at 1 in the afternoon. And what he had to show for it was a half-acre of windrowed brush and a small but serious dent in the deck of the brush hog, where he had run over the corner of a piece of buried angle iron that nobody on earth could have known was there. The second day he started early at 4:30, working by the headlights of the John Deere until the sun came up behind him. He got 2 more acres down. The third day, the hydraulic line to the lift cylinder split, and he lost 2 hours patching it with a piece of replacement hose he found in the back of the implement shed. And by the time he got back to the field, a thunderstorm was building over the high ground to the west, and he had to pull the tractor back to the shed before the wind came across the open ground and turned the loose-cut brush into projectiles. He sat in the cab as the first heavy drops hit the windshield and looked out at the work he had not yet finished, and he felt for a moment every one of his 72 years. That was the evening he found the calf. Her name was Nothing. He didn't name them, but he had noticed her in the herd the week before, a small Angus heifer, maybe 3 months old, lighter than the rest, slower at the water trough. The kind of animal a man learns to keep half an eye on without quite admitting that he is doing it. She had gone down sometime that afternoon in the heat in the corner of the cattle lot, nearest the dry creek bed, in the only patch of shade the cottonwoods threw at that hour. The water hauler from the co-op was 2 days late because the driver, a man named Henry Vashek, had thrown his back out, lifting a feed sack, and was laid up at home. Walter had topped off the tank that morning with what he had drawn from the house cistern, but the house cistern was not deep, and 70 head of cattle in 95-degree heat could draw it down faster than a man could keep up. He found her at dusk. She was lying on her side with her legs out straight, the way a calf lies when she has gone past struggle into stillness. Flies were already at her eyes. He knelt beside her in the dust and he put his hand flat on her ribs, and he felt the long, slow nothing where there had been a heartbeat that morning. He stayed there a while, long enough that the light went from gold to that color the prairie takes just before the stars come, the color his mother had called wolf light when he was a boy. He stood up eventually. He walked back toward the house in the dark, his boots heavy in a way they had not been heavy before. And when he came into the kitchen, Eleanor took one look at his face and didn't ask. She set down the dish towel. She poured him a glass of water from the pitcher and put it in his hand and closed his fingers around it. He didn't drink. He said, "I'm calling Cora Whitfield in the morning." Eleanor did not answer right away. "I'm telling her I'll take the restructure. Whatever they want to do, I'll sign it. We'll sell off 40 head and pay the truck bills through fall, and I'll let the back 100 go." "Walter, I mean it, Eleanor. I lost a calf today. I lost one, and I'm gonna lose more if this heat keeps up and the hauler can't come, and I'm out there chasing a... Well, my grandfather dug in 19 and 21 like I'm some kind of..." He stopped. He could not finish the sentence. Eleanor walked across the kitchen slow, the way a woman walks when she is thinking about her next words very carefully. She did not touch him. She went to the stairs and went up them, and he heard her footsteps move down the upstairs hall, and he heard the small creak of the cedar dresser drawer opening, and then her footsteps coming back. She came down the stairs and crossed to the table and set the cedar box on it between them. She did not open the box. She put her palm flat on the lid. "Your father did not put this thing in our hands so you could give up in the 5th week, Walter." She said it quietly. There was no edge in her voice. There never was. That was part of what made it land where it landed. He was a man who knew exactly how long a thing takes. He buried the card in the back of a folder labeled County Correspondence because he knew you'd find it the year you needed it, not the year before. He told Otis Pemberton you were a slow man, and he said it as praise. He did not raise a quitter, Walter Brennan, and I did not marry one. Walter looked at the box. He looked at her. She lifted her hand off the lid, and the small, soft impression of her palm warmth stayed on the wood for the half-second before it disappeared. And Walter Brennan put his face into his hands and sat that way for a long time, and Eleanor did not say another word, and the night moved on around them in its quiet way. He went out again at first light. By the end of the next afternoon, he had cut down to the last quarter-acre of brush in the northeast corner, and Otis was sitting in a folding camp chair at the edge of the cleared ground with a thermos of black coffee and a hand-drawn sketch on a piece of notebook paper. The same kind of paper Silas had used, the same red margin running down the left side. Otis was directing him in increments now. 6 feet east, 2 more north. Stop. He climbed down from the tractor a dozen times that afternoon to walk the ground with the toe of his boot prodding for the give that would tell him something solid lay underneath. He found a length of barbed wire from a fence that had not stood since 1968. He found the ceramic insulator from a telegraph pole. He found a Prince Albert tobacco tin rusted shut that Otis took in his hand and turned over slowly and sat down on the camp chair beside him without comment. The blade caught at 4:15. It was not a hard catch. There was no buck or jolt. It was the kind of soft resistance a man feels in his hands through the steering wheel, a brief sense that the machine has touched something that does not want to move. He killed the PTO. He climbed down. Otis was already standing up out of the camp chair. They walked together to the place. They knelt. Walter pulled away the cut brush, the matted leaf litter, the loose top dirt of 3 decades working with his hands. And then with a short-handled spade, Otis had brought in the bed of the Chevy. The earth came away in dark, wet layers, and underneath the layers there was something flat and round and rust-colored and old. He stopped digging when his spade rang against it. He brushed the surface clean with the side of his hand. Cast iron, 18 inches across, the letters faint but readable under the patina. Harwell Supply, 1921. Otis sat back on his heels in the cut grass and was silent for a long time. Then he said very quietly, the way a man speaks to a memory, "Hello, Mose." Walter looked at him. Otis was not looking at the cap. He was looking at the sky above the cap where the late sun was catching the underside of a single hawk turning in the thermals over the creek. "Hello, Pa," Otis said again, softer. Walter put his hand flat on the iron. It was warm from the sun on top and cold from the earth underneath, and the seam of those 2 temperatures ran right through the meat of his palm, and he felt it the way a man feels a thing. He has been moving toward his entire life without knowing it. He did not lift the cap that day. They had agreed they would not. There was procedure for opening an old well venting, testing the air, lowering a light, and Otis had insisted, with the quiet firmness of a man who had pulled 3 asphyxiated bodies out of farm wells in his career, that they would do it properly or not at all. So they covered the cap loosely with a tarp and weighted the tarp with stones, and they walked back to the truck together as the day's heat went out of the air. Walter slept that night. For the first time in 9 days, he slept the whole night through, and when he woke up, there was no envelope on the kitchen table because Eleanor had moved it. The new envelope on the kitchen table was different. It had no return address. It was hand-addressed in block letters that he did not recognize, and inside it was a single sheet of yellow legal paper folded in thirds and a check and nothing else. The check was made out to Walter Brennan in the amount of $900. The signature line read, "Cash." The note said in the same block letters for the water hauler, "Someone ought to cover it this month. A friend." He stood looking at it a long time. He showed it to Eleanor when she came down. She read it. She set it back on the table. Her hand went to her throat in the small, unconscious way it sometimes did when she was holding back a thing. "Who?" he said. "I don't know." "Edgar Hatcher, you think?" "Maybe." "Or somebody at the church?" "Maybe." She poured him coffee. She poured herself coffee. They sat with the envelope on the table between them, and Walter understood for the second time in a week that the county he had lived in for 72 years was not the county he had assumed. People had been watching. People had been keeping their counsel. People had been deciding, in the small private way people in country places decide things, whose side they were on. And the side they were on was not the side that owned the new F-350. He cashed the check in Valentine that afternoon. He paid Henry Vashek's wife in person and asked her to give her husband his regards and tell him there was no rush to be back at work, that another driver would do for the next 2 runs. He drove home through the long gold light of a Friday in late July. And when he pulled into the lane, there was a man standing at his front gate that he had not invited and did not particularly want to see. The man was perhaps 35 years old. Clean shirt, clean boots, a white pickup with the seal of Cherry County on the driver's side door. He had a clipboard. He had a small camera looped around his wrist. He had the unmistakable posture of a man who had driven out from somewhere with a regulation in his pocket and intended to apply it before sundown. His name was Marlon Hatch. He worked for the county engineer's office. He had received a tip, he did not say from whom, and the way he did not say. It was eloquent that Walter Brennan was in the process of uncapping an unregistered groundwater source on the northeast quarter of his property, in possible violation of the Nebraska Groundwater Management and Protection Act of 1986. He produced a folded copy of the relevant statute from his clipboard. He explained, in the careful, patient tone of a young man who had rehearsed this conversation in his pickup on the way out, that any private well drilled or reopened after 1957 was subject to permitting registration, casing inspection, and a sustained yield review that could take, depending on the workload of the state office, anywhere from 60 days to 9 months. He explained that the fine for non-compliance was $12,000 on the first instance. He explained that until the matter was reviewed, Walter was to cease all activity on the site and to consider himself formally notified. Walter stood with his hands in his jacket pockets. He let the young man finish. He looked past him for a moment out at the long flat reach of the pasture in the evening light, at the line of cottonwoods marking the dry course of Whitman Run, at the cattle moving slowly toward the water tank in the dust of their own passage. He felt the 90 days of the bank's letter pressing on him from one side, and the indefinite months of the state's review pressing on him from the other. And in between them, in the narrow space where Walter Brennan lived, was a well. His grandfather had set in the ground in 1921 and never registered with any office of any government, because in 1921 there had been no such office. He looked back at Marlon Hatch. Pre-1957 wells are exempt, he said. Aren't they? Marlon Hatch did something with his face. It was the small involuntary tightening a man does when an old gentleman who looks like he doesn't read much has just quoted the one clause that ruins an afternoon. Grandfather Wells, Walter went on. I read the Act, 1986. I read the implementing rules. A well drilled prior to 1957 that has remained in continuous ownership by the same family does not require permitting for return to service, provided the original construction can be documented. A small wind moved across the yard. That's correct, Mr. Brennan. Then I'll document it. Sir, I have to advise you that the burden of documentation is significant. We require contemporaneous records, drilling logs, construction receipts, newspaper records, county-filed surveys. The state will not accept testimony alone, and if the documentation cannot be produced within 30 days of notice, 30 days. Yes, sir. Notice given today. Notice given today. Marlon Hatch was looking at him now without the patience of his rehearsed speech. Looking at him the way a young man looks at an old one when something is being communicated that the young man had not expected to receive. Walter took the folded copy of the statute from his hand. He folded it once more and put it in the breast pocket of his jacket. "You'll have your documentation," he said. Marlon Hatch hesitated. Then he nodded. Once got back into his white pickup and drove out of the lane in a thin trail of dust that hung in the evening air a long time after the truck was gone. Walter went into the house. Eleanor was at the kitchen counter peeling apples for a pie she did not particularly intend to bake, which was what she did with her hands when she needed to be doing something while she thought. She looked up. She saw his face. She set the paring knife down. He told her. 30 days, contemporaneous records, drilling logs that had never existed because Ezra had not hired a driller, construction receipts that had burned in the kitchen fire of 1947, the one that had taken half the household papers and all of Ezra's correspondence, and the only photograph of his mother as a young woman. The deed abstract back at the courthouse made no mention of the Wells were not deed items in 1921. The county surveys from that period had been lost in the courthouse flood of 1962 when the Niobrara had come up over the bank and put 11 feet of brown water through the records office. There was nothing on paper anywhere. Eleanor did not speak for a long time. Then she dried her hands on her apron, walked to the front room, and came back with her purse and her car keys, and the heavy maroon cardigan she wore when she meant business. "Where are you going?" "The Historical Society." "Eleanor, it's almost 6. They're closed." "Marjorie Tilden has a key. She owes me from when I subbed for her 9th grade civics class in '09. She kissed him on the side of the mouth, brief and dry, the way she had been kissing him for 47 years. "Don't wait up." He waited up. He sat at the kitchen table with the cedar box open in front of him, and the index card laid out beside it, and he read the 6 words on the back of the card over and over, until the words stopped being words and became something else, a shape. A small dark window into a room he could not yet see into. He waited until 10 o'clock. He waited until 11. He waited until just past midnight, when the headlights of Eleanor's old Buick swept across the kitchen window, and the engine cut in the driveway, and her footsteps came up the porch. She came in carrying a manila folder. Her hands were trembling slightly. She did not put the folder down. She held it against her chest the way a woman holds something she has just lifted out of a fire. "Walter," she said. Her voice was not quite her own. "Walter, you need to sit down. There's something you need to see." She set the manila folder on the kitchen table and slid it across to him without sitting down. Her coat was still on her shoulders. Her purse was still hooked over her arm. She had driven the 78 miles from Marjorie Tilden's house at the south edge of the county at a speed he didn't want to know about on roads he didn't want to picture. And her hands were still shaking slightly as she opened the folder for him, because she did not trust him to open it himself. Inside was a photocopy. The original had been a newspaper page from the Valentine Republican, August 18, 1921. The paper soft and brown along the edges where 8 decades of basement air had worked at it, and Marjorie had run it through the Historical Society's scanner 3 times before she got a copy clean enough to read. The headline on the lower fold of page 7 was set in a kind of plain serif type that nobody used anymore. "Ezra Brennan completes." Second stone well on North Quarter donates spare limestone to county schoolhouse. He read it once standing, then he sat down, then he read it again. There was a paragraph beneath the headline, 6 lines of close-set type, that described in the careful prose of a country editor that one Ezra Brennan of the North Quarter of Section 11 had on the previous Thursday struck water at a depth of 42 feet, that the well had been hand-excavated and lined with cut limestone, freighted from the Niobrara quarry by Mr. Mose Pemberton of Gordon, and that the surplus stone, some 3 wagon loads, had been donated by Mr. Brennan to the trustees of the Cherry County Schoolhouse District 3 for the foundation of a new outbuilding. The article gave the date of completion. It gave the depth. It gave the construction method. It gave the name of the man who had helped and the destination of the leftover stone. It was in every respect what Marlon Hatch's clipboard had said could not be produced. Walter looked at his wife. She was crying finally the way she cried, which was to say almost not at all, just a single line of water down each cheek that she did not bother to wipe. Marjorie wouldn't take a dime, she said. Said her grandfather had taught at District 3 from 31 to 58. Said she'd been waiting her whole life for somebody to ask her about that schoolhouse. He folded his hands together on the table and held them very still. There's more, she said. She drew a second sheet from the folder. It was a photocopy of a hand-drawn plat, the date in the lower corner, reading, Cherry Company Assessor 1923, and on the plat in the careful pen of a county surveyor, whose name Walter would never know, was a small circle in the northeast quarter of Section 11, and beside the small circle the abbreviation W. That was all. One letter, a circle, a well that the county had recorded 2 years after his great-grandfather had dug it. On a map that had been filed in the assessor's office and had survived the courthouse flood because it had been bound by chance into a volume that sat on a shelf 18 inches above the high water mark in 1962. Walter put his hand flat on the photocopy. He did not say anything for a long time. Eleanor sat down across from him. Then finally and took her coat off and laid it over the back of the chair the way she always did, and she reached across the table and put her hand on top of his hand. They stayed that way for a while. Outside a coyote called, somewhere out past the windbreak, and was answered by another from further off, and the kitchen clock ticked the way it had been ticking for 47 years. He drove the documentation to the county office on Monday morning at 9. Marlon Hatch was at his desk. He took the folder. He read the article. He read the plat. He looked up at Walter once briefly, and Walter saw in his face the particular expression of a young man who has been raised on the assumption that the country he works in is a country of regulations and forms and timely filings, and who is being shown in the space of a single morning that the country is also a country of newspapers from 1921, and grandfathers who donated limestone to schoolhouses, and that both things are true at once, and that the second thing has been quietly running underneath the first the whole time. Marlon Hatch stamped the documentation received. He looked up. I'll process this today, Mr. Brennan. The exemption applies. You're clear to proceed. Walter nodded once. He did not gloat. He had not come for that. He picked up the carbon copy of the receipt, and he walked out into the morning. And he drove home with the windows down and the air coming in across the seat smelling of cut hay from the fields north of town. Otis came on Thursday with the venting equipment. They worked through the morning. Otis lowered a candle on a length of fishing line down through the cap hole he had drilled in the iron lid, and the candle went down 42 feet and did not gutter, which meant the air at the bottom was good, which meant the well had not gathered the heavy gases that old shafts sometimes gather over decades. They lowered a battery-powered light next. They watched it descend, the small bright circle of it shrinking and shrinking against the dark of the stone, And then, 15 feet down, the light struck a surface that gave it back a flat black mirror, sitting quiet at the bottom of 100 years of limestone. And Otis whistled softly through his teeth and said only, "There she is, Walt." They lifted the cap that afternoon. Eleanor was there. So was Edgar Hatcher from the hardware store, who had driven out without being invited and brought a thermos of coffee and a small wax paper package of his wife's molasses cookies. So was Henry Vashek, walking with a slight hitch in his back, but walking, who had insisted on driving the water hauler out to the field even though Walter no longer needed the water hauler, because Henry had decided he wanted to be present. So was a man Walter didn't recognize at first, leaning on the fence at the far end of the cleared ground in a faded denim jacket, hat low. And when the man straightened and lifted the hat in a brief small greeting, Walter saw that it was Cora Whitfield from the bank in her off-hours clothes, having driven out from Valentine because Marjorie Tilden had called her on Tuesday and told her she ought to be there. They lifted the cap. The smell that came up out of the shaft was not a bad smell. It was the cool, still exhalation of a space that had been closed since October of 1921. The smell of limestone and groundwater and patience. And Walter stood at the edge of the open well and breathed it in once slowly, and then again. The crows in the oak tree at the far end of the lot had not flown. They sat very still on their branch, watching the way crows watch a thing they have decided is worth watching. The county hydrologist arrived an hour later in a state truck. He ran the tests. He pulled samples. He measured static water level at 15 feet, drew down the shaft with a portable pump, watched the recovery rate on a stopwatch, and ran the math on a clipboard he held propped against his thigh. He worked for 2 hours without small talk. When he was done, he capped his pen and he looked at Walter and he said, 16 gallons a minute sustained. Sandstone aquifer around 220. Hardness is moderate. pH right at 7.2. Clear of nitrates, clear of coliform, clear of every contaminant on the standard panel. A pause. "I'd put this water against any well in the Sandhills, sir. It's about as good as groundwater gets in the state of Nebraska." Walter received the news the way he had received most of the news of his life. He nodded once. He shook the hydrologist's hand. He stood at the well's edge with Eleanor beside him after the state truck pulled away, and he looked down into the dark mirror of the water at the bottom of the stone, and he did not speak, because there was nothing yet to say that the well itself was not already saying. 6 weeks later, in the second week of September, the dust had begun to settle in both senses of that phrase. The water line from the well to the cattle tank had been laid by a young plumber from Valentine who had charged Walter half his normal rate and refused to explain why when Walter asked. The bank's letter had been answered formally with a copy of the well registration and the hydrologist's report attached, and Cora Whitfield had personally driven the response into the regional office. The note on the back 100 had been removed from active risk review. The interest rate had even come down a quarter point under a Heritage Agricultural Conservation Clause that Cora had pointed out almost shyly the week after the cap came off $25,000 in matching state funds for the restoration of pre-statehood agricultural infrastructure, which the limestone well, having been dug in 1921 from native stone by a homesteader's son, comfortably qualified as. Walter signed the paperwork at her desk on a Tuesday morning. She did not look at him when she handed him the pen. She looked instead at a small framed photograph on the corner of her desk, a black and white print of a man in work clothes standing beside a Massey Harris tractor in what looked to be the late 1970s, and Walter, glancing where she glanced, understood without being told. "Your father," he said, "worked for yours 1978 and 79. I remember him. He talked about Silas Brennan until the day he died. Said he was the only man in this county ever paid him in cash on a Friday with a handshake and a thank you. Said he never forgot it. She smiled a small smile down at the desk. I was 9 years old. I listened to every word. Walter signed where she pointed. He thanked her. He drove home through a country that was beginning finally to take on the slant gold light of autumn. On the second Saturday in October, Dale Kramer's Ford F350 came down the county road. It was not the same Ford. The chrome package was gone. The dealer lot stickers had long since come off the back window. The whole truck looked smaller somehow, the way a man's possessions look smaller when the man inside them has been through something. Dale pulled into the lane and parked at the bottom of the porch steps and got out without slamming the door, which was new. Walter came down off of the porch and met him at the gravel. The two men stood there a moment without saying anything. Out past the windbreak, the cattle were grazing in the south pasture. The herd a slow dark line against the gold of the fall grass, and the cottonwoods along the dry creek were beginning to turn the color. The cottonwoods turned in mid-October, that high yellow that seems to give back more light than it receives. "Combine's gone," Dale said. "I heard. Sold the back 40 to cover the second note. Going to lose the rest by spring if I don't." He stopped. He worked his jaw a moment. "I ain't here to ask for money, Walt." "I know it. I'm asking if you need a hand. This spring. Calving fencing, anything you got. I'll work cash, I'll work trade. I'll work for the use of your old 55 Chevy 2 days a month. I don't much care." Walter looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the morning in July of 2003 when this man, 21 years younger and full of himself, had laughed at him from the open window of a different truck. He thought about how much of those 21 years he had carried that morning in his chest, without quite knowing he was carrying it. He thought about Eleanor saying, "He did not raise a quitter," and about Silas saying through Otis, "He is a slow man, mean it as praise," and about Ezra in 1921 donating 3 wagon loads of limestone to a schoolhouse district that had no money to pay for it. There was a pattern in those things. He had not invented it. It had been there the whole time, running underneath the country, and his only job in this moment was to recognize that he stood inside it. 7 o'clock Monday morning, he said. Dale looked up. "Bring your gloves. There's a 1/4 mile of fence on the north end that's been needing a second man since June." Dale Kramer nodded once. He did not say thank you. The thank you was not the kind of thing that Dale Kramer was going to be able to say out loud yet. And Walter, who had known him for 40 years, did not require him to. Dale got back into his truck, and the Ford backed out of the lane more carefully than it had ever come down it, and turned west toward town. The spring after that was the spring Caleb was born. He was Walter's first great-grandchild, the son of Walter's grandson Owen, and Owen's wife Marisa, who lived in Lincoln and worked as a physical therapist at a hospital there. They drove out in early May when the boy was 3 weeks old. Owen carried the baby up onto the porch in a blue knit cap that Eleanor had made herself, and Walter took him into his arms, this small warm weight, this new person. And he stood for a long moment on the porch with the boy against his chest and looked out at the pasture where the spring grass was coming in green and the new calves were finding their legs. That evening, after the lamps had been turned out and the house had gone quiet, Walter went upstairs and opened the top drawer of the cedar dresser and took out the cedar box. He brought it down to the kitchen. He set it on the table where the light from the single lamp above the sink fell across the worn brass hinges, and he opened the lid, and he took out a fresh index card from the small stack he kept in the drawer of the writing desk. With his father's pencil, the same yellow Ticonderoga sharpened to a stub, now that he had kept in the box for 35 years and used for no other purpose, he wrote on the new card in the small, careful block letters that his father had taught him, Drilled 1921 by Ezra Brennan. Reopened 2019 by Walter Brennan. Casing sound. Water clear. Pass it on. He laid the card on top of the original beneath the cufflinks. He closed the lid. He heard the small soft click of the brass catch, settling the same click that had settled 1,000 times before in his life, and would settle some uncertain number of times again before the box passed out of his hands and into another's. He carried the box back upstairs. He set it in the drawer. He stood at the bedroom window for a while in the dark, looking out across the pasture toward the northeast corner, where the well now stood under a small wooden housing he and Otis had built that summer from rough-sawn cedar. And he thought about all the things that had been kept in this country, in this house, in this family by men and women who had not advertised the keeping. The carriage bolts in the canvas pouch, the check for $900 signed cash, the newspaper page sitting in a bound volume 18 inches above the floodline, the plumber's half-rate bill, the framed photograph on the corner of Cora Whitfield's desk. A country he thought was the sum of what its people had quietly chosen not to throw away. Eleanor came up the stairs behind him in her slow, soft way and stopped at his shoulder. She put her hand flat between his shoulder blades. They stood that way for a while. "You all right, Walter?" "I am." She kissed the back of his neck once. She turned to go to bed. Then she stopped halfway to the lamp. "Walter?" "Yes." "You remember what your father said to give you that box?" He thought a moment. The kitchen on a February night in 1984. Snow on the window. Radio low. Eleanor, 23 years old, at the table beside him, just past their second month of marriage, listening. He said some things are kept, not abandoned. There's a difference between those words that most people never learn to feel. Eleanor nodded slowly in the dark. She turned off the lamp. In the small wooden housing at the northeast corner of the section, the well sat as it had sat for the past 104 years, lined in limestone that Mose Pemberton had quarried in the summer of his 19th year, holding water from an aquifer 220 feet below. And somewhere down in the dark of its shaft, the slow, inexhaustible movement of the Ogallala continued, the way it had continued before any of these names had been spoken, the way it would continue after every one of them was gone. The patient water of the high plains, doing what patient water has always done, which is to wait for the people who finally remember what their fathers told them. If there's something a parent or grandparent once told you to keep: a tool, a book, a piece of land, a small wooden box with something inside it you've half forgotten, leave a word for us below. Tell us what it was. Tell us whether you kept it. Because some things, as one good man once said, are kept and not abandoned. And the difference between those two words is most of what a life is made of. Sleep well tonight. We'll see you tomorrow.